This is the Tank Talk podcast with Belinda Glenn.
Welcome to Tank Talk. Looking forward to chatting with you about the Sharks. And I think the one burning question on many Sharks fans' minds at the moment is, has that incredible Currie Cup victory come back to bite us? But before we get into that, let's chat about the game against Benetton. Now, I must confess, that is the first game that I've actually been able to sit down and watch the whole thing as it was happening. For the first game, I was on the park and ride bus on my way back from that fantastic game between the Springboks and Argentina in Mbombela. But, checking the scores, seeing how well they were doing, 20 points ahead at half time, looking promising. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, apparently, because it ended up being 36-30 to Connacht at the end of the game. And so, a few alarm bells ringing for Sharks fans. We've been there before, losing our first game on the road, but also not the end of the world. People lose first games on tour. That's not cause for panic stations just yet. Then, obviously, we played the Dragons the following weekend, and I was at a gig giving myself whiplash, trying to watch the band and the game at the same time. We did not seem to be in that game at all. It was not looking promising. And then I found myself in the bar for the last 10 minutes of the game, watching us somehow snatching victory from the jaws of defeat. And though it was obviously only a 3-point win, we beat them 33-30, I think it calmed the nerves a little bit. It made people feel better about the fact that, yes, okay, we did get an away win on the road, and it was good. We showed some temerity at the end there, so that was great to see. And so I think fans went into the game against Benetton feeling confident, feeling like, yes, this is definitely a game we can and should win. I will say I think most fans go into games against the Italian sides now probably feeling overconfident because those teams are not quite the minnows that they used to be. They've certainly grown and developed and are building up a better track record. However, this obviously was Benetton's first win of the URC this season, and they're a team that the Sharks absolutely should be beating. But it was a comprehensive defeat, unfortunately. If you haven't seen the score or if you've been trying to forget it, it was 38-10 to Benetton, which definitely not what you want. And so the funny thing is that the first quarter of that game, they looked pretty evenly matched. Not to mention that their jerseys looked pretty evenly matched too. I don't know how we're still having kit clashes like that in this day and age where both teams are wearing predominantly white jerseys. But anyway, let's not dwell on that. They were pretty evenly matched in that first quarter, and it looked as if really the Sharks were in it. And then it all fell apart in the second quarter of the first half. Benetton scored 3 quick tries, and that just seemed to be it for the Sharks. Like, they really just dropped their heads at that point and didn't seem to be in the game after that. They certainly did have opportunities. They were in Benetton's 22 a lot, but they weren't able to capitalize on those opportunities. And I think we do have to give credit to Benetton. One of the main reasons that the Sharks couldn't capitalize on those opportunities is that Benetton's defense was excellent. So credit where it's due, that game wasn't just lost by the Sharks, it was also won by Benetton, and they played really well and they deserved the win. A special mention to Reno Smith, who obviously used to play for the Sharks, and he was man of the match, scored 2 tries, played really well. I think his career is thriving there, so that was really nice to see. But what wasn't really nice to see was one of the other big contributors to why the Sharks were not able to capitalize when they got into the 22. They just, a lot of the basic errors that we were concerned about during the Currie Cup still seem to have carried over into this game. Scrums misfiring, death by 1,000 handling errors, passes not sticking, tackles not being made. the real basics of the game that they need to be getting right at this level and that they should be getting right. And so I think that's really something that the coaches are going to want to look at, because if we can't get the fundamentals right, it's going to be a very long season for the Sharks and for those of us who love them so much. But the biggest issue, and it probably contributes to getting those fundamentals wrong, the biggest issue for me is fatigue. I looked at those players in that game and they looked absolutely exhausted in the first half already. They looked shattered. And so you have to ask yourself, going back to the question I posed earlier, what has the impact been of that Currie Cup? You know, two very, very brutal games to close out the Currie Cup, the semi-final and the final, both very physical games. That semi-final against the Bulls obviously lasting 100 minutes. And so what has the impact of that been on this team? I also think, you know, the one glaring difference is that in the Currie Cup, it was very clear that the players had this self-belief. They were so sure that they could win, and that seemed to be missing on Saturday. And I think that self-belief is really what carried them through that semi-final, where, yes, they didn't win, but they, despite being down to 12 players, which shouldn't be happening, they still believed that they could make it through. They got through the 100 minutes. They scored more tries than the Bulls, and that's obviously why they got through to the final, despite it being a draw. And so they had that never give up attitude. They were determined. Likewise, in the final, I mean, you want to talk about BMT, how many other teams are going to take that long range penalty after the hooter and nail it to win the game? I mean, that was absolute self-belief and confidence and BMT. And it just seemed to be missing in this game. They really seemed to drop their heads. And so I find myself wondering, you know, not only what are the impacts physically of those games and then traveling straight afterwards, but what are the mental impacts? And so are these players just so tired that mentally they just weren't in it anymore? And so I think we have to consider the fact that of the game day 23 on Saturday against Benetton, at least around 20 of those players were involved in some way or another in the semi-final and the final, many of them in both of those games. Many of them also involved in various ways in the Currie Cup throughout the campaign. And the same is true for the other games that they've played on tour so far. So, you know, you had a 27-man touring squad. The vast majority of those players were involved in the Currie Cup. And I don't know what the answer is to that, because there were obviously a lot of factors. There's so many competitions happening at the same time. The Sharks also had and continue to have an extensive injury list. So perhaps they were not able to rotate their players as much as they would have liked to. Perhaps they had to bring their URC players in sooner than they would have liked to. They always planned to use the Currie Cup as a bit of a preseason for the URC. Perhaps they didn't expect to make it all the way through to the final of the Currie Cup, and so didn't know that they would have to travel immediately after playing in that final. Obviously, the semi and the final both played at altitude, both away from home, and then straight away traveling to Europe. It's not easy, and it's not about making excuses or anything like that, but it isn't easy. And I think we also have to just consider the timing of the away games. It's just worked out in a way that was unfortunate for the Sharks. You know, the other two teams that were involved in those playoffs for the Currie Cup were the Bulls and the Lions. Their draw of fixtures enabled them to play at home for their first games of the URC, meaning that they also, not only did they not have to travel, but they also had access to their Springboks much earlier. And so the Sharks rightly obviously could not access their Springboks. They were away traveling for the games, but also the Springboks were obviously having a well-earned rest after their very impressive rugby championship campaign. So it's just an unfortunate set of circumstances, and I'm not sure that there really is an answer to how that can be solved, because some of those things were just beyond anybody's control. Some of them may have involved better planning, but when you've got so many injuries, it's tough. And so I think, there's a lot of people already writing the Sharks off, saying, oh, it's going to be another 2023-24 season again. This team has so much talent. What are they doing with it? All the things that we heard last year. And I would just say, like I said earlier, it's not about making excuses. And maybe those people will turn out to be right. I don't think so. But I do think in this situation, which is quite unusual, where they've had this Currie Cup and gone straight into the URC the very next week on tour in Europe. We've all heard about the travel woes for the South African teams traveling to Europe. I think there's some context that we have to consider, and perhaps a little bit of grace for this team and these players, and say to ourselves, let's not write them off yet. I think there's opportunity still for them to come back and show us what they're made of, and that this season is not necessarily going to be a repeat of last season. I also think, fortunately, now they will be at home and they will have access to their Springboks. The Springboks will be back from this weekend. And as much as I firmly believe that we shouldn't rely on our Springboks, we cannot only win games when the Springboks are available, because A, we have plenty of other talented players who should be able to win games. B, the Springboks are just not available all the time, so you cannot only rely on them to win games. We have to be able to maintain that consistency and that cohesion throughout the team, regardless of who's playing, whether the Springboks are there or are not there. That being said, in this situation where we've had these players playing in the Currie Cup and now on tour for the URC, they're exhausted. There's so many injuries. To make sure we don't get even more injuries, I think it's crucial that we have the Springboks back for this game so that some of those other players can be rested and we can find a way to turn the season around. It's definitely not too late. It's only 3 games in. There's no need for panic stations yet. We have 2 very tough games ahead of us. We obviously play Glasgow Warriors this weekend. A nice little preview of the game against Scotland for the Springboks that will be involved. They're the current title holders. Won't be easy. The following weekend, we then play Munster, who won the title the previous season. Also not going to be easy. But I do believe that this team absolutely has it in them to win both of those games. They're both being played at home, so we're back on home turf, back in front of the fans. I think this is the moment where this team has the opportunity to show people what they're really made of and to get their season back on track. And I believe that they can do it. So very much looking forward to the game against Glasgow Warriors this weekend. And let me know what you think. I'm keen to know what you think about the games coming up as well.
This is the Tank Talk podcast with Belinda Glenn.